Oh, okay. Yeah, I am too.
I mean, okay, go, all right.
Oh, who? Lucille Wilfer?
What do you like for schedule?
My ranking is number two.
Yes, come in.
Good evening. I'd like to call to order the City of Albany Budget Committee work session. May we have a roll call, please?
Collins.
Here.
Crispin.
Here.
Pearson.
Here.
Keller.
Here.
Canopa. Golden.
Here.
Olson.
Here.
Here.
Kellum.
Here.
Connolly.
Here.
Kopsinski.
Here.
Coburn.
Here.
Johnson. Here. Thompson.
Here.
Thank you. Sharon will join us shortly. Is there any public comment tonight?
Anybody here that is not staff?
Yeah.
Do we have any staff anywhere else in here?
All right, so we have, one of the things that we had emailed to us was the budget calendar. Did everyone have a chance to take a look at that, or does anyone need to look at it?
I did.
Bessie?
I will more than likely be gone the week of the 10th.
Okay. Did anybody else submit time that they would be away, or generally people here in May? Okay. Any discussion on the options or questions?
That's the only one that works for.
My preference would be option number 3 over 3 weeks, but that may not be workable for a lot of folks, so I could easily do it over a 2-week period, but trying to cram it all into 1 week would be a bit much for my weakening brain cells.
Thank you. I feel the same way. I like it over 3 weeks. Sometimes we struggle with losing too many people on trips, so.
Yeah, I think option 3, I mean, I might not be here, but that'd be on
Option 3 works for me.
All right, so can we have a motion?
So moved. Option 3.
Well, we used to bang it out in 2 or 3.
All those in favor of option 3 for the budget calendar this year?
It's Friday night.
Aye. Anyone opposed? Okay. Thank you. And so we'll move on to the city manager's report.
I'll start this year with what I think is good news. More importantly, I think it's news that confirms a lot of the things that we've been talking about for several years, both at the staff level and here at the budget committee as well. And so that news is a report that we received today from Standard & Poor's Rating Services, and it rates our general obligation bonds as they do as they do every year. And the lead sentence is the good news. It just says that it raised, Standard & Poor's Rating Services raised its long-term and underlying rating for Albany to AA minus from A plus on Albany, outstanding general obligation GO bonds. The outlook is stable. And if you read the entire report, what it basically says is that they looked at the broader area in which Albany sits, and they felt that the demographic of the region were better than what they had been giving credit, what we had been given credit for in the past. So I think what they're saying is that while parts of Albany, particularly the Lynn County part of Albany, we have a higher unemployment rate, we have lower household incomes, we're a bit of a drag on our rating. There are higher income places, there's a larger job market than just in Albany itself, and we got some credit for that. And so that's good news. That means is if the city chooses to go out and issue a general obligation bond for whatever purpose, we would pay a lower rate as a result of having a better rating. And that sounds like a small thing to people, but it can amount to a very large sum of money over time. Some of the good things that they noted in the report, they said an adequate economy, so that's speaking to that, the sort of demographic, general financial information. The one I like, it says, Albany's management conditions are, in our view, strong, with good financial practices under our financial management assessment methodology. So that's really good. This is the one we've been talking about for a number of years, and this one's not so good. But it's one that I think we've all been very aware of. It says, Albany's budgetary flexibility is, in our view, weak, with available reserves falling to 4.5% of operating expenditures in fiscal 2014, down from 5.3% the previous year. And it says the city has maintained adequate available reserves in each of the past 3 years, but they don't like the fact that it was declining. So that's a weakness, if you will, in our financial position. They also say, in our opinion, very strong liquidity supports Albany's finances. And again, this is a positive thing. It just means that we have access to cash when we need it. We're not in danger of, not being able to meet payroll. I'm sure the folks behind me will be happy to hear that, and as am I. And so again, a relative strength. Our budgetary performance is rated as adequate. Again, they make note, however, of that declining ending fund balance issue. Albany's debt and contingent liability profile is strong. So they're saying we're not, we've sometimes been accused of being horribly in debt, and this is a terrible thing for our citizens. At least according to the rating agencies, they don't see it that way. And it says, finally, it concludes, we consider the city's institutional framework score as strong. And in their letter to us, they also issue a letter, telling us what's happening. They just basically said that the raised rating reflects our clarification on the city's participation in the regional Benton, Lynn, and Corvallis metropolitan statistical area, which improves its economy score. Further supporting the rating is our view of the city's very strong liquidity and strong management conditions. So, again, overall, there are more positive than negative statements, which is a good thing. But I think it also emphasizes the message that we've been trying to give to the Budget Committee over the past several years. A couple of years ago in an arbitration hearing, I was accused once by an arbitrator who, well, I won't give any editorial comments on it other than to say that the arbitrator said, well, it looks to me like you're trying to tell the public that everything's great, but you're trying to tell the employees that there's no money. And when in fact, the message I was trying to get across is that we do a lot of things well, and that there are strengths, but there are these weaknesses, and they're only going to get worse over time. And I think that message has sort of been confirmed by this report.
Yeah, refresh my memory, you said right at the beginning that we went from a AA+ to a AAA minus?
No, we went from an A+ to an AA-. So
Okay.
a single A+ to a AA-. And what we've been told is that that's about as strong a rating as we can get given the demographics of the community. I mean, one of the big issues that affects how you're viewed is how wealthy is your community, and the reality is we're not a wealthy community and aren't likely to be in the near future.
Rich has a question.
Yes, sir.
Perspective, that change is one level?
Mm-hmm. Yes, we bumped up one.
Yeah. What's the total? There are going to be a lot of folks who, this is Greek.
Uh-huh. I think the best rating you could possibly get, I believe, is a AAA. AAA plus, yeah.
I can describe how it breaks out.
By all means.
3 away.
Yeah, for Standard & Poor's, and Moody's
Yeah.
rates a little differently, but Standard & Poor's, there's AAA, AA, and single A. And within AAA, AA, and single A, there are 3 gradients, minus,
0 and plus.
0, and plus.
Yeah.
So AAA, we're not in the AAA category, but we're at the low end of the AA.
The reason I've emphasized this over the last number of years too, or one of the reasons I've emphasized it is, we can talk, I can offer you my judgment and opinion on the financial condition of the city. Obviously, there's an inherent bias there on my part, but as with many things that we do in the city, we try and work to standards. We set standards and goals in our strategic plan
that call for us to have, to achieve Government Finance Officer Association performance ratings of excellence for our financial reports and for our budget. And we do that every year. We look to have an accredited police department and an accredited public works department, and again, that's been, and we just, if you may have seen it in the paper, that we just achieved that rating for our public works department. This is another one of those another one of those standards that I think gives some independent validity to whatever claims it is that we're making about the kind of job that's being done in terms of managing the city's finances. And I don't want to present it as an unqualified success, because I don't think it is, but I think it's, given what we've been through and given some pretty difficult economic times, unlike some other cities around the state, we've managed not only to retain our ratings, but actually improve them and be in relatively solid position. But that's going to be an important theme that I'll talk about tonight, about our ability to continue doing that without making some changes in the way we operate. So I thought I'd start out with that. And then just wanted to give you a real brief review of sort of the statutory responsibility of the Budget Committee. And I think we may have done this in the past just briefly, but I'll give you the statutory reference, and folks can look at it for themselves. The relevant ORS, Oregon Revised Statute, is ORS 294.426 to 294.428. And 96 basically talks about the composition of the Budget Committee and what you have to do, or to give notice for meetings and that sort of thing. The second is Budget Committee hearings and meetings and approval of the budget document. And it explains in the first part of 428 that the Budget Committee shall approve the budget document as submitted by the budget officer, which would sound like you had a pretty boring job if that was the end of the sentence, but it's not. It says, or the budget document as revised and prepared by the Budget Committee. So the way we've interpreted it, and I think the way it's done in most cities around the state, most jurisdictions, because counties operate basically under the same system, is that you appoint your budget officer, a budget is prepared by your staff, and the Budget Committee then reviews it and makes whatever changes you feel are necessary to that document. So it's not, if you go through these statutes, there's not much more direction than that about how to do it, what you can do, and I've seen it interpreted a lot of different ways by a lot of different budget committees over the years. But I think the standard is generally, let's take a look at the budget, and let's, if there are things we like, we'll talk about that, and they'll get included. If there's things that we don't like, we'll ask that they be changed. And I've never been able to guess exactly which way budget committees are going to go on that issue. So again, I would just encourage you to look at the statute if you have any questions about sort of the legal basis for a budget committee. The second thing I wanted to talk about, and maybe this is the most important thing that I can talk about, is the basis for our budget, which is the city's strategic plan. And it almost feels like I've been talking about it for years, but never been able to articulate it in a way that excites much interest. But I'm going to keep trying, because to me this is really the essence of what we're trying to do here, is to figure out how we can make Albany be the community we want it to be now and into the future. And we have a plan that we've been working on for for longer than the last decade. It's certainly not been perfect, but it's one that has guided a lot of our energy, a lot of our money, so that when citizens ask, well, why are you doing this, or why are you investing money here versus money there, we can turn to the plan and say, this is what we're trying to accomplish. And it speaks to things like when we get down into the actual allocation of resource, it gets into things like levels of service that we think are baseline in order for Albany to be the place we want it to be. And so we include the strategic plan in every budget. There's a copy in there. We review it every year, and we're currently in the process of reviewing it right now. And that'll be coming to the City Council before long. One of I guess the principle, if you're looking for an umbrella term for how we're doing budgeting based on our strategic plan, the way I would describe it is I'd borrow a phrase from some folks who have made a fair amount of money in recent years with what they're calling a new theory of budgeting. I'm not sure I agree with that, but they're referring to it as priority-based budgeting. And that's where you're determining how much money you spend based on the things that are important, really important to you as a community. And I think we've been trying to accomplish that for a number of years. Now, how well we've done it, is probably arguable, but that's as opposed to making it into some kind of numerical calculation. There's sort of incremental budgeting, which is very common, where you just take how much did we get last year, and you get a percentage increase or a percentage decrease, depending. There's zero-based budgeting, which is where you start from the first paperclip and say, what does it take for us to do the job? And we build a budget based on that, from that zero base up. And then there's the term that I'm using here, priority-based budgeting, where you're trying to allocate your resources based on your highest priorities. And you have a plan in place that you're working from to accomplish that point. So that's what the strategic plan attempts to do. We've gotten pretty ambitious as well in trying to lay out fairly specific objectives in our plan, very specific things that we want to accomplish, and then determine, okay, how do we maneuver our resources or plug in our resources in a way that gets them done. And I'll use an example of how it works, how it plays out in sort of the day-to-day management of the city. I had a good example with the police chief here just last week or two. He was in my office and said, we've had a real problem lately in the community. He was looking at crime stats, and there's actually going to be a presentation on crime stats at our next council work session. And he was looking at crime stats and said, crime is down in the city, but I've noticed here lately that we've had a real rash of car break-ins and sort of petty theft, that sort of thing. And it was in a particular area. So he said, I'm pulling people from this area and I'm having them focus on that area where we're having the problem right now. And that's kind of the principle that we're trying to engage in throughout the city, is looking at the things that you can do to drive outcomes, that you're measuring and looking at where the problems are and then allocating your resources appropriately. And that's sort of on a, like I said, or a monthly or a weekly kind of basis. And on an annual basis, you're trying to look at the bigger picture and making sure that you have enough resources to be able to do those kinds of things. So the strategic plan, from my perspective, is a very important document that to me, explains a lot about what we're trying to accomplish with the annual budget. The message for this year as we start the budget, I'm starting with some assumptions. And the first is that one of our primary goals with the budget is financial stability. Because if you don't have that, then it jeopardizes everything else that you're trying to accomplish. So we start with that as one of our highest goals. Secondly, this year, we're approaching the budget with the idea that we're not looking at significant service reductions. And that goes back to the strategic plan, where we've been committed to trying to provide various services at what we hope is a level that's at the very least acceptable to our citizens. And thirdly, one of the third assumption is that we're assuming that folks are not looking for significant increases, that we're not in a time of such robust economic growth that we could say, oh, let's add a whole new range of services or dramatically increase what we're doing. So those are kind of the three major assumptions going into the budget formation, that we want to be financially stable without seeing any real reductions in services or any particular increases. And so, in order to accomplish that, I think, in the year ahead and with the budget that we're going to be putting together, we believe this year that we really need to look at raising some revenue, which is not something we've really done much in the past. We've tried to avoid that. We've recognized that over the last particularly 5-6 years that conditions have been pretty tight. But one of the key reasons why we think raising some revenue is really important, and here I'm focusing on the general fund, is that we have, one of the things that we attempted in the past to do was to cover our public safety expenses with a 5-year serial levy. And what's happened is that the purchasing power, if you will, of that levy has declined over time, to the point that in this current fiscal year, we will lose about $1.5 million to compression from that levy. So, and I can tell you that if we had that money, if that money were actually available to us, then we wouldn't need to look at raising additional revenue to meet those assumptions that I talked about. Now, of course, there's always another option when it comes to dealing with maintaining stability when you've got rising costs and revenue isn't keeping pace, and that's to cut expenditures. But one of the approaches that we've taken in recent years is, instead of budgeting based on need, and saying, okay, how much do you need each year, and we'll try and meet that need, we've said this is how much money we have. And it's sort of like I don't know about the rest of it, but it's sort of like your home budget. Most of us don't say, oh, well, let's build our budget based on what we see as our wants and needs for the year, or else we'd probably be spending more than we make. We say, well, how much do we have? And you build your budget kind of based on that. So cutting expenditures at this point would require us to change one of the assumptions in building the budget. If we cut expenditures in the general fund, we will be cutting service levels in all likelihood. Which doesn't mean you couldn't cut expenditures at some point. That may be a choice that you would want to make as you look over the budget, and of course you certainly have some combination of raising revenue and cutting expenditures, and I might add also reallocating how you spend money, where you spend money is another way to approach that. So, as we go into the budget process, that's kind of the background that we're facing, that we're looking at. And Chair Fulton had asked me to mention some of the things that are going on through the course of the year that, planned expenditures that we know are likely to be out there. As many of the commission members may know, we had a relatively small increase in our water rates in December. We do this every year. Usually we look in December at our November, December at our water rates. We had a 2% increase in water rates. And then in June we'll be looking at our sewer rates again, and there's an expectation. We usually have a projection of what the increase will be, and then we try and modify that projection based on actual conditions. For example, the projected water rate increase this year I think was 4%, and we were able to recommend 2%. I think the projection, I've forgotten the projection for sewer, but ideally we may be able to lower that a bit as well. So that's certainly significant. The commission may also be aware that the City Council voted to expend a pretty large sum of money just Monday, or at least to commit to a partnership that will probably result in a very large sum of money for economic development here in the community. In exchange for agreements with 7 of our major employers to create somewhere between 500 and 1,000 jobs over the next 5 years, the city has agreed to put up about $2.9 million to help train people and purchase equipment necessary for that training to be able to fill those jobs that are scheduled to be created. So that has a bearing on the city's overall outlook, because in the past that money has been sitting in a sort of a reserve fund that, when the rating agencies do look at us, they'll say, oh, well, they've got this very large sum there, and it's now still there, but it's to a smaller degree. The other big project that we have this year that is that the council will be considering is, and that consideration will probably take place at our next city council meeting, February 11th, I believe it is whether or not to put a bond measure on the ballot to construct a new fire station and a new police station. And I'm sure the commission's aware that we had a facilities review committee that met for over a year, had many, many meetings, spent a lot of time looking at the issue, and made some very specific recommendations, and the council agreed to accept those recommendations. So that will certainly be out there, and will I'm guessing will go as a request to the voters, although that's still to be determined at this point. We have, of course, the usual range of public improvement type projects. You'll hear more about that during our capital improvement plan process, where you probably recall every year we meet with the Planning Commission and the City Council to review the capital improvement plan. And I'm not going to try and go into all those, but I think those are the major things that we can be looking at. I think the biggest challenge that we face this year and probably for the next couple of years is figuring out how to maintain minimally acceptable staffing levels, particularly in public safety, with the budgetary resources that we have, and with some fairly minor or limited revenue raising measures as well. So with that, I think it might be easier to wait till after Stuart gives his presentation, because he may answer questions through the course of that, but we'll certainly be able to, or willing to answer any questions that you might have. So Stuart, I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Well, we met last in November and presented some information, the most current information that we had at that time regarding property tax revenue and where we were at in the current year budget. There are some brighter spots as we've been going through the budget in the current year. In a couple areas, a couple I'll mention. One is, you recall in the current year budget, we moved the ambulance fund to the general fund. The calls for service in ambulance are at record highs, and that tends to coincide with record payments for ambulance fees. So ambulance fees are actually coming in ahead of budget. Prior year property tax numbers are coming in higher than anticipated, and I'd mentioned there'd been consideration previously on what level we would anticipate would be collected of property tax, and so estimated pretty conservatively on what would be received in each year in property tax, and looks like that number will exceed our estimates in the current year. Court fees and planning fees are also a little ahead of budget. So what it's looking like is a little bit more optimistic picture than we were presenting in November. And consideration would be still, as Wes described, probably looking at some revenue enhancement or options for a combination of revenue or cutting expenditures. The other one I wanted to mention, those that I mentioned were on the revenue side. One on the expenditure side that's really good to mention. Chief Bradner in fire pursued dollars that had been allocated through the SAFER grant, but that we had not been able to use due to turnover in positions, and he was able to receive approval of additional funding that was still allocated but not received, and that'll be an amount of over $100,000, which will offset expenditures where those current positions are being funded in the general fund. We'll be able to move those positions back to the grant fund. So a combination of things gives us a little better position now than we had described in November, as we're anticipating going forward in the budget. This is typically our first budget committee meeting of the year, and typically I thank you again for your service on the budget committee. It is a big commitment, I realize that, and appreciate it. And I think each year both the committee members and I are learning quite a bit more about process and what may be more useful information, beneficial to the budget committee members, beneficial to our community, and beneficial in the preparation of our budget. So the direction I'd like to take with the financial trends and the forecast this evening is very similar to prior years. There are some significant changes that I'm going to point out along the way. I would like to invite a viewing audience to look for the budget document on our website. And so I can give just a brief introduction of how to find it on the website, because what I'm going to present and the slides that I prepared are pieces of that larger document, and actually pieces of pages of that larger document. So I want people to be aware that the document is available. It's in its entirety on the city's website under the Finance Department, and that website's indicated on the screen, cityofalbany.net, and then under the Finance Department. And there you can find all of the city's financial documents, the adopted budget for current year and prior years, the financial reports, the popular annual financial report, the ERA budget, as well as the financial trends and forecast for prior years and current year. So a lot of information available on that site. And I want to give that little introduction up front because, as I mentioned, as we look at slides, I'm going to give little pieces. So to give an idea of what's included in the larger document, the format that we're using was developed by the International City Management Association and is indicated on the screen, ICMA, and it's an FTMS model, which is the Financial Trend Monitoring System. And the larger document includes there are over 20 indicators in the larger document that's available online and that Budget Committee members have in hand and have received, that describe different comparisons and different indications of relative financial strength of the city. The parts that I'm going to present, as I mentioned, are kind of pieces of that document. So I want to make sure that people are well aware the larger document is available, because I just want to touch on a few of the smaller pieces. So on page 2 of the Financial Trend and Monitoring System is the revenue indicator for property tax revenues. And I wanted to pull this one up on the screen just to show an indication of something that I'd actually like to discuss a little bit in more detail later. And that's the annual percent change and how that would influence the forecast section. And the part of the document that's very different from last year is the forecast section. And in this screen, for illustration, to indicate the type of information that's included in the report, this is a piece of a table on page 2 that describes property tax revenues and change on an annual basis. And as you can see, since 2010, the annual percent change has decreased in each year until the current year, or until the year end 2014, when it showed growth. And that growth is a variable that's used in the forecast. It creates one of the assumptions in the forecast that we've probably hit bottom and we're seeing more growth. And that's reflected both in property tax annual percent change as well as in permit fees and planning and other indicators. So, and the property tax revenue is reflective of the types of indicators that are included in the document regarding revenues of the city. Another revenue of the city that's important to identify is the property tax loss to compression. And Wes referred to this in his comments. If we had the revenue that voters had approved for the public safety levy, and those public safety levy dollars are used in support of police and fire and are moved into the general fund for those purposes. And as this chart indicates, as Wes was describing, in 2014, a little less than $1.4 million lost to compression. And as we look at the forecast, and I'll describe the basis of the forecast, it would suggest that in year 2015, that would increase to 1.5 million of revenue lost to compression. And that's what's kind of created the void in the revenue side of the equation, and that we're looking for ways of filling at least part of that revenue and replacing a part of that revenue. So the next one I'd like to indicate is an expenditure indicator. So as indicated in the report, 20 different indicators are divided among revenue, expenditure, and then operating position and economic position. And an expenditure indicator that I wanted to show, not the table, but the graph for, is also something Wes referred to, the full-time equivalent employees. one of the significant ways that we've been able to live within the decreasing property tax revenue and decreasing rate of growth, which is still an important distinction. There was only 1 year where property tax actually went down from the prior year. But what we've seen is a decrease in several years of the rate of growth. And the costs for collective bargaining agreements, for materials and services, and some of the other areas that we've talked about, particularly materials and services where we've reduced contributions to equipment replacement, those kinds of things we've done to live within the available revenues.
Stuart, just quick,
Yeah.
as you flip to another subsection, can you tell us what page?
Oh,
you're
I'm
on?
sorry, I
Yeah,
meant-
you're on page 10 right now.
Page 4
Page-
was the
For the FTE,
compression.
it was page 4, now it's on page 10.
Now it's page 10.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I made note of that, and I forgot to mention it. Thank you, Rick. Yeah, so on page 10, the expenditure indicator for employees indicating full-time equivalent employees in the general fund, and again, limited to the general fund over the last several years. And then next one I'd like to indicate is page 17, which is the operating position indicator for ending fund balance. And as Wes mentioned also with the letter from Standard & Poor's, they identified this as an area of potential weakness in our financial position. And it's reflected very well in this graph, in that we've been eating into the ending balance. One area of strength that the Standard & Poor's letter described was the management controls that were in place. One of those controls is a collection of financial policies that's reviewed and adopted by the City Council on an annual basis. And the financial policies indicate that our ending balance in the general fund and really across funds will be between 5 and 15% of expenditures. Now, take into consideration that we budget 5% of expenditures, and in a balanced budget, the expenditures equal the revenues. So we budget 5%, and if you notice on that table, that percent of total expended is decreasing quite a bit. It's getting narrower, that gap, and that's why it was pointed out, and it concerns me, and the Standard & Poor's was right on point. We're still within our policy guidelines, we're still within 5% at year end, but because we budget 5% to begin with, the minimum should be 5% at the end, and we're just barely above that, which leads to a couple of considerations. One, revenues are either not coming in as budget, or expenditures are increasing, and it's really been a combination of both. And that gap between what was budgeted and what's expended has narrowed. And we've actually, in the last couple of years, had a reduced ending balance because of that. So that's probably among the trends. Of course, the loss of property tax and the public safety levy due to compression and the reduction in ending balances are the two indicators that I'm most concerned about and would like to draw attention to. And then final one on operating position that I'd like to mention is the one referred to as debt. And it's been one of interest, so
What page?
Oh, I'm sorry, page 16. Yeah, keep me on task here. So I am jumping around, so I appreciate that. So page 16, and this one, as you can see by the trend line, is not an area of concern, but it's an area where there's a lot of interest. And so I wanted to particularly draw attention to the general obligation debt per thousand of assessed value. And this is actually, we only have one general obligation bond. And the bond that is outstanding will be paid off in June. And at which point, the city will have no general obligation bonds outstanding. As Wes mentioned, the council is going to consider an election for a bond issue. If the voters were to approve that bond, at this point, it looks like the cost per thousand of that new bond would be 31 cents per thousand of assessed value. The existing bond in the final year of payment in current year is 38 cents per thousand of assessed value. So there would be a reduction in the cost going forward of what is supported through general obligation debt by the taxpayers. That's an important consideration to have in mind. with that, those are the indicators that I wanted to draw particular attention to. And Ray, you have a question?
Yeah, you mentioned on page 17, the ending fund balance that it shows here of 7.41%. And Wes, I think you mentioned the S&P said it was something less than 5.
Well, it could be they're talking about different things. I'd have to go back to the S&P report. They said, and they may not have been specific to the general fund either. That's,
Well, let me mention, because there are some distinctions in the numbers that Standard & Poor's use, or in the descriptions they gave. And as I mentioned, they're right on target. They're exactly correct.
Which is why I brought this up, so.
They're referring to, in a couple of their comments, they're referring to governmental funds in that balance that they gave, the 5%, was it 4%? Includes the general fund, the street fund, Parks and Rec, and one more that I'm not remembering right now. Anyway, the governmental funds, I think
yeah,
it's listed in.
it is Parks and Rec, Street, and General Fund. Those are the three.
Okay, the three governmental funds. So they use a combination of those funds to do their analysis, whereas ours is specific to the general fund.
Okay.
And I think there, as I looked at theirs too, where they said that our operating revenue, our operating expenditures exceeded our revenue in 2014, that caught my eye as well. And I think they're using a little bit different definition of operating expenditures than I was using, because my number's a little bit higher in that regard too. So a little bit different. That's what I think attributes to the differences in the numbers at this point, those two items. Okay, if I could, any other comments, questions on the indicators? As I mentioned, a big change in the approach this year is in the forecast, and I'm going to show just a small piece of what's actually in the larger document. But I want to use it as an indication or as for illustration. This is a piece out of page 22, which is a forecast for the public safety levy option. And this piece is the forecast for year 2016. And there are a couple things I wanted to describe, and I hope it's a more useful document for the Budget Committee. It's a more useful document internally at this point, and let me describe why. So, as the table indicates, that's included on page 22, it gives a history, a 9-year history of actual receipts, actual revenues, in this case, the actual experience of the change in assessed value or the change in compression in the public safety levy. So there's quite a bit of information provided in the table. And then it gives an estimate of the current year, 2015, and then a forecast for the next 3 years. So on some of those tables that are included, and in the forecast in the full document, we included a similar forecast for property tax for the public safety local option, which this is a piece of, and also the general fund operating costs. And in each of those three categories, the same information is given, and the same approach is taken on the arriving at the forecast. And so in the case of the public safety levy and what's on the screen, whereas it's Lynn and Benton, those are the receipts that were the to-be received number from Lynn and Benton County for the public safety levy. The minimum amount, and each of the forecast years includes a minimum, a mid, and a maximum. The minimum is if the current year were duplicated into next year. So if the experience of the current year was the same experience we had next year, in other words, if we had the same % growth in assessed value in next year that we had in current year, and if we had the same % change in compression in next year that we have current year, then what we would receive would be that minimum line. And as I mentioned back on slide 1 with the property tax revenue, it seems that there's a bounce, that we've turned the corner on the property tax. There are strong indicators that looking forward, there's probably going to be growth. And so the midline is actually the recommended line going into the next budget. And the midline is saying, well, I think we're going to do actually a little bit better than current year. So in forecasting 2016 at a recommended level is saying, I think we're going to do a little bit better than we did in the previous year, or in the current year. And so that's the midline, and that one's in bold on the forecast to show that's what's recommended. That's what the budget is being built on. And in this case, it's identifying growth in the to be received and the property tax to be received from Lynn County and Benton County, and seeing a reduction in growth of compression. Not eliminating compression, but what we've seen in the last few years is a reduction in the growth. And so what's being forecast in next year's budget is that compression will only grow by 5%. And that's the estimate for increased growth in compression. And that results in, as we can see, compression of 1.483 million. And as I described, if the increase in next year were the same as this year, or a 9.63% increase in compression, we would lose over $1.5 million to compression. So those are the assumptions, and I think this approach, although it's a lot of numbers, as I say, it's more useful, and I think it will be much more accurate on staff level, and I hope it communicates well for the Budget Committee as well. So the max would be the very optimistic look, and that will be a gauge or something to compare to in future years to evaluate the estimate above current year activity to see what change seems to be a more accurate or more reasonable change going forward. But in each of the forecasts that is presented, this is the methodology that's being used. So the forecast in the next year budget has a minimum level that's based on current year activity. And if that current year actual experience were mirrored into next year, that would be the minimum line on the budget. And of course, it's based on assumption that we're going to see growth. If the assumption where we're going to see decline, then that minimum might mirror, but it would probably be the mid, or the proposed would be there would be less growth. And so those percents would reflect that. I hope that's fairly clear. And as I mentioned, there's a much bigger page and a lot more information in the booklet. At the bottom of this page for the public safety levy shows a graph that reflects the same information. So it shows the information with the history that I described, 9 years of history of actual numbers in the public safety levy, and then activity in 2015, which is current year estimate, and then those estimates going forward, or the bold line, the midline that's recommended as the forecast in the 3 years going forward. And as Wes described, those become our budget numbers that department directors are then asked to build their budgets to meet. So we actually have forecasts now where they could anticipate, based on the assumptions that are put into the budget, what dollars may be available in future years. We allocate those dollars based on size of current year budgets, and with some consideration on actuals versus budget. We start with budget numbers, but there are changes in actuals where we've had some restructuring or reorganization, or there were unforeseen circumstances. Those are given consideration in the baseline for future increases or future allocations of what we identify of dollars that would be available. But, yeah, Will.
Who is making the forecast for the property values in the future?
I am.
Just you? Okay.
And I have discussion generally with the county assessor and also with our planning department. I get annually a report as we put the budget together of permits issued to date, and that's included in the executive summary in each year's budget. And using that kind of information and looking at the historical trends. And it's interesting because this year I've made a distinction more carefully between Lynn and Benton County, and the performance has differed. And Lynn County has kind of led the way, both in reductions going into the recession and in coming out. And Benton County's lagged about a year to see how those changes have occurred. And of course, the Lynn County being the much larger piece of the community and piece of the pie has a much greater influence on the outcome. And that's been helpful then to actually been helpful to break those out, because I think it's more accurate. And that's my presentation on the financial trends and forecast. And there's a lot of information, as I mentioned. I've just given little pieces of pages within the document, so I know there's a lot of information, and hopefully you've had opportunity during the past week, several days that you've had the document. If there are questions that we could hopefully answer questions you might have this evening. And again, I would welcome any time if there was time you'd like to schedule apart from this meeting for specific questions, I'd be happy to talk through it. And as was suggested last year, I've tried to incorporate some enhancements and some better ways of presenting data, and I welcome those comments as well.
Thank you, Stuart. Lloyd?
Remind me again, the public safety operating levy was a 5-year levy this time that we passed, and it expires when?
We're in the second year of the third 5-year levy, so the expiration would be 3 years from now. That would be 2018. Does that sound right? Yeah. Chiefs, yeah.
Okay. So what I'm wrestling with my own mind is I can't remember the details, but as with the Lynn County Sheriff's levy and the effect of having a revote after the passage of legislation dealing with urban renewal districts and compression, we could consider going out early to reauthorize that levy, which could have the effect of freeing up some of the compression money. Is that correct?
That's correct. We haven't done an analysis to be able to tell you what the number would look like. It would not be, from the city's perspective, I don't think it'd be a huge number. Urban renewal is a pretty small portion of the total amount. And of course, if you reauthorize, I guess, you're only picking up the city's piece of it, so.
As opposed to under levy?
Yeah.
Right.
Scott?
Too soon to ask a question about the third section on the other funds, or is that you're going into that next?
I typically haven't, I've only responded to questions there.
Okay.
I don't have the...
Page 29, which is the street funds. Obviously, it was not, I don't think, foreseen that the price of gas was going to drop so dramatically. Is that going to have a positive impact on the budget because of the expenses of the city for purchasing fuel?
Yes, it will, in that our cost for fuel, go down. Not sure what that dollar amount will be. It's probably low tens of thousands of dollars in a year, but like Wes said earlier today, 10,000 here and 10,000 there helps a lot.
Adds up to serious money.
Yeah.
Scott had a question or comment?
Yeah, I was wondering if we could get a copy of the Standard & Poor's letter that you just had.
Sure.
And it would be real beneficial since they possibly use some different criteria and variables than what you used to. Could you give us a comparison saying, here's what they said in their letter was the difference, or our declining ending balances, and here's what you had referenced when Ray was talking about it earlier, so we can see what's the difference between what you were saying and what they were saying.
We can do that, Scott, but I got to tell you, it's not, there's not much difference. I mean, it's a pretty small overall difference. I mean, I think if you get this, you can regard it as accurate.
Right.
You know, I mean, the difference wouldn't, I don't think it would inform you or.
Well, my only concern was we've always been fixated on that 5% figure, and when you said all of a sudden they came in at less than 5, I said, whoops, we got some problems.
No, yeah, and you know, that's a policy for the general fund that we will not drop below 5%. We never have, and we would be in violation of our own policies if we did that. So they're using a slightly different terminology, but in terms of the overall effect on, you know, the principle that they're describing is accurate. That's all I really was trying to get across, and then I don't think you'd see much benefit in seeing Stewart's difference in terms versus their.
And it would be kind of difficult because I don't know their methodology.
I thought in one of the graphs you had like 7.4 million and they're referring to just barely over 5. That'd be a $2 million difference, and I thought that was relatively significant, but if the report is pretty self-explanatory, I'm fine with that.
I think so.
Okay.
If you have, what I would say is that if you had questions at the end of your own review, I'd come on in and talk with Stuart about it. It's probably easier for him to show some of the differences rather than.
And you just got the report, so
no
problem.
Stuart,
Do you have any idea how many basis points the shift makes from a A+ to a AA-, assuming the same principal face value of bond?
Yeah, I
base market?
did talk with our financial advisor about that at one time, and this afternoon was trying to remember that number. And I think it's as much as 20 basis points.
Which is 0.2%.
Yes. And that's my conservative, trying to remember what the question was, and it's been a little while, but I think it was 20 to 25. That's why I'm going closer to.
That's a measurable number
20
over a
basis points.
25-year bill bond.
That's right.
Yeah, and
It's significant dollars on that.
sort of the law of big numbers, if you're, if we took, for example, an $18 million bond measure over 20 years, it represents a significant savings.
I guess I'm presuming that we're going to smile in the paper about having our bond rating changed, and maybe a little bit of explanation about what it means.
Well, it was actually in the paper. There was a news release issued, and there was an article in the newspaper saying that it happened. Unfortunately, this is good news, and so it tends to be a real small article in the paper.
That's why I didn't see it.
We need to smile then.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's, for city managers and budget committee members, it is a reason to smile and feel good, and we all acknowledge it, but it's not something that tends to capture a lot of attention.
Well, it would be nice if the taxpayers could see the smile.
We'll do our best to keep talking about it.
Okay, is there any other Budget Committee comments or discussion for tonight?
I guess I have one. In dealing with the smiling effect, maybe the place we have where that can be manifested is if the council moves ahead with the recommendation of the Public Safety Facility Task Force. They were projecting 31 cents, as Stuart said, and part of that projection is formulated in the interest rate. If we rerun that bond with the 20 basis points lower, we may be looking at 30 or 29 cents. And that's the place I think we can get some smiling leverage out of that.
And I can request that additional look.
That's a good point, Floyd. That's what people can relate to and understand is the savings.
Right.
Your comment, Wes, you look at 18 million and 0.2% or whatever it is in 20 years, and it's a lot of money, and what is it?
Yeah.
What is a lot of money? What do you say? Rich was
And I don't want you to really hold me to the 20 basis points.
No, I understand.
Until they ask the question.
I understand, but put it in some terms that we can all relate to.
But we're over here chipping this in stone, is making sure. Stuart said.
Hey, signed here in blood.
Yeah, I guess just a comment. I mean, Stuart, I think, made a good pitch about, the volume of information that's available to you online through the reports that we issue. One of the tough issues that I think we deal with these days is that we have so much information. And you can go online and you can see how much we've spent in every line item in the city as of tonight. And do that every day if you're really bored. And, there's the popular annual financial report, there's the CAFR, or the comprehensive annual financial report, there's the audit report, there's the budget report, and these are not little, as if you've looked at them, they're not little thin documents, and they all, they provide a piece or a picture of what's going on, and our task is to try and summarize that as best we can, and, try and give you an honest portrayal of what's going on, and what we try and do is back that up with things like the S&P, with like our audit reports, for example. But as someone who was once an elected official, who once sat on a budget committee, I know how confusing that can be. And, if there are questions that just, are lingering, or you're not getting it and you would like some further explanation, we will try very hard to sit down and put it into English if you want to do that. So please feel free to take advantage of that option. And I know several of you have over the years.
On page 26, the airport seems to be doing quite well with funds, and I see that they receive some transient lodging tax revenues. Are all of the different sections of the city government available to transient room tax revenues?
No, at this point, the policy that was adopted by the city council about 3 years ago now allocates a certain portion of the transient lodging tax for capital improvements at the airport. So it's a specific designation in use of those funds.
I see.
Well, but I would hasten to add, Colleen, that the council could change that policy. Now, there are state laws that put some restrictions on the use of transient lodging tax. We couldn't, for example, this year we're anticipating, I think, that we'll receive something over 900,000, could be even as much as $1 million in transient lodging tax. We can't just say, oh, let's take that $1 million and give it to the police department or the fire department, much as they would appreciate it, because there are these restrictions. However, it has been a policy choice of the city council to say, look, we think it's wise to reinvest a significant portion of transient lodging tax back into activities that we think will either sustain or increase that revenue source. And so they have, by policy, chosen to put it into things like the Albany Visitors Association and the airport, and it's a pretty small amount that goes to the airport. What am I missing?
Northwest Art and Air.
Or the Art and Air Festival, things that hopefully are putting people into our hotels. But there are other cities, and in fact, I've worked for one of those other cities where they would take the bulk of transient lodging tax, as much as they legally could, and it would go into general fund activities like police, fire, et cetera. So you have that option.
Okay. Thank you.
Might be nice to know how effective those things are.
Well, we actually had a meeting today on that very subject, and
I heard about it.
I think some good news, and hopefully we'll have a better idea. Although, it's a tough nut to crack.
Any other comments or discussion for tonight?
With the good news that you've provided us with this and the growth of in the property tax valuation that you spoke of, do you have a plan then to restore the ending fund balance to an area a little above the 5%?
We will try and do that in the budget, yes. Try and at least see it, at the very least, hold the line, and ideally start to increase it. I should emphasize, and I guess we didn't strongly enough, the slightly better news that Stuart was able to provide about some lowered areas of expenditure and some increases in revenue still doesn't get us to where we need to be in terms of aligning revenues in the general fund to expenditures. We're still spending more than we're making, even with that good news in the current fiscal year. And we've got to close that gap. And that's going to require either an additional revenue source or some serious reductions in service. And we have ideas that we will be presenting to the Budget Committee about how we can try and close that gap. Additionally, and it's reflected in Stuart's projections, we believe, based on the level of activity that we're seeing, that we'll get some help over time with increased property tax from increased assessments. There's kind of a joker in the deck about what happens with assessed value, because it's dependent on property values, and they are going up, but they're not going up real fast, and even you can have increases in one area that are offset by decreases in another, and that complicates the issue. The real short-term help particularly for any of our property tax supported services is growth in assessed value by adding new improvements. So a big building, like a Lowe's Home Improvement Center tends to help, or
Titanium.
Yeah. The biggest, of course, and I've said this before, the biggest property tax payer in the city is the Target Distribution Center. A lot of assessed value there, so another 4 or 5 of those would really be nice from that perspective.
We need a Google search.
Stuart?
Yeah, let me respond a little bit too, Will, because I think my recommendation to the Budget Committee going forward, if there is available revenue that could be applied to increasing a ending fund balance, at this point, we're not funding equipment replacement, hardly at all, to speak of. Well, actually, we aren't funding equipment replacement. We're funding police vehicles that are on a leased contract. It's the only, and it's funded through an equipment replacement portion of our budget. But I would recommend maintaining the minimum level of contingency until we're funding equipment replacement in a healthier, much healthier position.
Thank you.
That's a good point. And I should add, you know, we get caught up in thinking in terms of the general fund, and sometimes don't express things about other funds. So when we say we're not funding equipment replacement, we're doing fine in our utility funds. We are more than adequately, well, I'm sure, is Mark back there? Doggone.
Careful.
We are not more than adequately. We are adequately funding equipment replacement in our utilities. And in our information technology. We fund that through our central services, and we've done a good job of maintaining that. Where we fall in short is in public safety, and again, if you look at, well, why is that so? It's because the amount of money that we're losing to compression from our public safety levy, which was sort of designed to help ensure that that money would be there.
Thank you.
Bessie?
Stuart, I was just, on page 21, I was just curious, it says to be received is reduced by HP and Comcast decisions. How much are we losing because of the
In 2014, the amount lost was $270,000. And in the current year, in the current year is $77,000. Now, I did hear the end of a news clip tonight. I think there was a decision today on the Comcast, but I didn't hear the part that said what the decision was. So I gotta go home and investigate
Couldn't
that.
you rewind it? All right, thanks.
Do we have a date yet for the SIP meeting? Is that in April?
CFP?
Yeah,
Typically,
we do.
2nd of April, April 2nd. Yes, we do have a date.
Meeting is this?
CIP.
Yeah.
Using all those fancy words here.
All right. If there's no other discussion, then we'll adjourn.